Hello, today I am joined by Manès Weisskircher, Doctor of Political Science at TU Dresden. Hello, Manès.
Hello.
Thank you for accepting my invitation.
Thank you.
So we will be talking about the rise of the far-right parties and movements in Western Europe. And let's begin with the concept of the rise of far-right populism. How do you account for this rise? Many people refer to economic reasons, the others cultural reasons. Some are talking about the legitimacy crisis in general. How do you account for it?
Development that cannot be reduced to more recent events like the economic crisis only or the so-called refugee crisis only, but radical right parties have been quite strong since decades in some Western European countries. Of course not in all, but in some their success started already in the mid-1980s, 1990s the latest, Austria, France, Denmark. So it's a long-term process. We need to look at long-term factors. You're right, the debate has been, is it only economics, is it only culture? Recently, fortunately, some scholars put forward studies that emphasize that it's a combination of factors going away from these monocausal explanations. Yes. I would support that. I would say it's a combination of a long-term crisis of democratic trust, first. Second, immigration and perceptions of immigration. And third, economic hardship. These three long-term factors have caused the rise of the radical right. And it's not short-term factors, just like, for example, the growth of social media, so-called social media or alternative media. That's often been given as an example. That would be way too narrow and not deep enough. Or in the past, like 10 years ago or so, some observers thought it was charismatic leadership that causes the success of radical right parties. That would also not be deep enough. So it's democratic trust or lack of, it's immigration and perception of immigration, and it's economic hardship, and these factors are long-term processes.
I see. What do you mean by the? What do you mean by the lack of democratic trust? Could you elaborate on this a bit, please?
I could actually. So we recently did an interesting study in Germany, a very stable electoral democracy in the eyes of many, well-functioning in the eyes of many. We did focus groups with random citizens, and we saw that many of them lost trust in the efficiency of political participation. So they supported the idea of democracy in general. They were strong advocates of the idea of democracy, but they were dissatisfied with real existing democracy.
Like liberal democracy, maybe?
Like the one they find in Germany. But similar observations also apply to other countries in Western Europe. People do not think anymore, or a significant share of the population thought that political participation has an effect, and they're dissatisfied with the outcome of government.
So do you think with the rise of far-right movements, they can possibly find what they are searching for?
That's interesting. It's an ambivalent answer that I give now, because maybe in order to propose a solution to that issue, many radical right parties advocate more direct democracy, and they want institutional changes that add bottom-up referendums, for example, to political systems in Western Europe. By now, maybe the radical right party family, apart from the radical left, is the strongest advocate of more direct democracy. But the voters of the radical right are not more in favor of direct democracy than the voters of other parties, which also shows that distrust or dissatisfaction with real existing democracy goes beyond the radical right voters only.
I see. So let's talk about a bit on the particular cases in Western Europe, and let's begin with Austria, where you're from, by the way.
Yes.
previously there was a coalition, a right coalition, with the participation of far right and central right, with the prime ministership of Sebastian Kurz, and it ended with a crisis. So how is it seen after the new elections? How, or let me reformulate the question, who won from the new elections?
The center-right, Sebastian Kurz, won clearly. He's the leader of the People's Party and until quite recently was the Chancellor of the Republic. Now there's a transition government. Most likely he will become the next Chancellor again. He won while the former coalition partner, the Freedom Party, the radical right, lost clearly. And it's quite interesting because actually both the conservatives of Sebastian Kurz and the radical right were affected by controversies about corruption.
Yes.
When it comes to the center-right and Sebastian Kurz, it was all about not being transparent about party donations coming from wealthy individuals, and also about spending more than was legally allowed for specific electoral campaigns. So Kurz faced some criticism, but was more or less immune against this criticism. Many people thought that also the radical right Freedom Party would be rather immune or rather unaffected by its own corruption scandal, Ibiza-gate, where the former leader of the Freedom Party was found to discuss the taking over of an Austrian tabloid with what he believed the niece of a Russian oligarch, but she was an actress in Ibiza. These negotiations, which were about taking over a tabloid newspaper, which were about giving the niece of the oligarch government contracts as an exchange, these negotiations that took place in a very drunk state were secretly filmed. The party leader of the Freedom Party didn't know that, had to resign. That was the trigger for the snap elections at the beginning of the year. And shortly afterwards, the European Parliament elections took place, and the Freedom Party only lost mildly. So many thought that also the Freedom Party would be immune this September. But just before the elections, new corruption scandals emerged. That's why the Freedom Party in the end lost strongly. So it shows that radical right success is not given at all, but yeah, like the success of every party, it's very unstable.
Well, there are already not many cases where far right came to power. Austria is one of them, and it's also an exception because it experienced also the fall of far right in a way with that crisis. So where did the voters, traditional voters of FPÖ, the radical right party in Austria, go in the elections? To the center right or?
Yes, so both already like 15 years ago, when there was a similar outcome of radical right government participation in Austria, and this year losses of the Freedom Party were of benefit to the center-right. So this time Sebastian Kurz could gain some of the Freedom Party's votes, and that's also because Sebastian Kurz and the center-right in Austria is quite special, because since years they also push for strong anti-immigration rhetorics. So Kurz strategically focused on trying to get parts of the anti-immigration vote, and he was successful.
So he is, or his party are not anymore the representatives of the conventional center-right politics? Or well, can't we say it?
We shouldn't underestimate that also in the 90s already many center-right parties in Western Europe were often quite critical about immigration. The key new feature was that anti-immigration stance was so central to the party platform 2 years ago, the second last elections, also this year again. So what makes him special is maybe not necessarily the anti-immigration stances per se, but the strong role these stances play in campaigns and in the everyday politics of the center-right in Austria.
So now let's talk a bit about Germany, where the far-right party, the AfD, is not traditionally strong as FPÖ in Austria. It's relatively a new party. So, but nevertheless, we see that AfD has been also on the rise in terms of its vote share in the elections, and the polls prove this. So, how do you see the development of AfD, and what reasons do German people have to vote for that party?
In Germany, it's quite funny. Many people assume that the so-called refugee crisis is essential for understanding the rise of the radical right. But that's a very German perspective, because in the case of Germany, it's actually to some extent quite true. The Alternative for Germany had its electoral breakthrough over the course of the so-called refugee crisis. In many other Western European countries, such parties already existed way before. So the AfD is quite new. What's unique in Germany is that it's a country that looks as it looks now only since 1990, after the so-called unification. And when looking at the AfD vote, we still see the divides between the former West German Federal Republic and the former East German communist state. The AfD is particularly strong in Eastern Germany. They are also significantly strong in West Germany, but they are particularly strong in East Germany, where, interestingly enough, the immigration share is very small. 95% of all foreigners in Germany live in West Germany, but still the AfD is most successful in the regions where there are not so many immigrants.
How do you account for that controversy or inconsistency?
Well, first it shows that there is not a clear direct relationship between immigration numbers and the radical right vote. Of course, immigration matters as a long-term phenomena, and studies also show that national immigration rates significantly influence the radical right vote. But yeah, you're right, it's not quite consistent, one could say. This has many reasons. East Germany has a quite different tradition of immigration than West Germany. West Germany was like Austria. They had guest worker programs, also with Turkey in the 60s. They received many asylum seekers during the Balkan Wars. They are economically strong regions where many Eastern Europeans moved to after the enlargement. East Germany was different. There was hardly any immigration. During the time of the German Democratic Republic, there was some immigration from Vietnam, for example, but on a more limited scale, and also immigrants were more divided from the rest of society than those immigrants in West Germany. So the history is different. People understand immigration differently, have less experience with it, and then also another important factor, economic hardship, plays a crucial role. Distrust in the functioning of real existing democracy is quite high. In Eastern Germany, this also relates to the difficult transformation period of the 1990s, especially when the East German economy faced many difficulties. Unemployment rates were quite high, and dissatisfaction from this period still matters now, and the cleavage between East and West Germany is still a big issue in German politics, and the AfD has managed to gain advantage from that.